Another day, another story. Since its founding in 1945, the organization has been on the front lines of some of the biggest events in world history. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. 1. Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted, 1948. From its earliest meetings, the UN General Assembly sought to ensure that atrocities on the scale of those that occurred during World War II would never happen again. On December 10, 1948, the Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which built on the principles of the UN Charter and served as a roadmap to safeguarding the rights of all individuals throughout the world. Eleanor Roosevelt, widow of U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, led the drafting committee and was recognized as the declaration's guiding force. The UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10, 1948. The declaration outlined fundamental human rights and freedoms that should be protected globally. Adoption by the UN General Assembly. The UDHR was adopted by the UN General Assembly at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris on December 10, 1948. It was a response to the atrocities of World War II and a commitment to preventing future human rights abuses. Drafting Committee. The drafting of the UDHR was led by a committee chaired by former First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. The committee included representatives from various cultural, legal, and political backgrounds. Unanimous adoption. The UDHR was adopted unanimously by the 58 member states present at the time. The approval reflected a global consensus on the fundamental principles of human rights. Preamble and Articles. The UDHR consists of a preamble and 30 articles. The preamble emphasizes the inherent dignity and equal rights of all members of the human family, while the articles outline specific rights and freedoms. Universal Principles. The UDHR proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It encompasses civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, emphasizing the indivisibility and interdependence of human rights. Influence on international law. While the UDHR itself is a non-binding declaration, its principles have influenced the development of international human rights law. The declaration has served as the foundation for the creation of legally binding treaties and conventions. International Human Rights Day. December 10, the anniversary of the adoption of the UDHR, is celebrated annually as International Human Rights Day. It serves as a reminder of the ongoing commitment to promoting and protecting human rights worldwide. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights remains a seminal document, providing a common standard of achievement for all people and nations. It continues to inspire advocacy for human rights, social justice, and the rule of law on a global scale. 2. First full-fledged peacekeeping force deployed, 1956. Though the UN Charter does not specifically mention the use of international armed forces, under the control of the Security Council, to mediate between warring parties, this type of peacekeeping has been an important part of the UN mission since 1956. The UN General Assembly met in its first emergency special session that November in order to address the ongoing Suez Crisis, which had begun when Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, a joint British-French enterprise. After pressure from the United States led Britain and France to accept a ceasefire and end their short-lived military action against Egypt, the first United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, was deployed to supervise the end of hostilities and the withdrawal of British, French and Israeli forces. The first full-fledged United Nations peacekeeping force was deployed in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. The crisis involved the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, which led to a military intervention by Israel, followed by the United Kingdom and France. The UN intervened to address the escalating conflict and establish a peaceful resolution. In response to the Suez Crisis, the UN Emergency Force, UNEF, was established. UNEF was the first UN peacekeeping mission with a significant and explicit peacekeeping mandate. It was deployed to supervise the withdrawal of foreign troops from Egypt and ensure the maintenance of peace in the region. Key points regarding the deployment of UNEF in 1956. UN General Assembly Resolution. On November 4, 1956, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 1001, which called for an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of foreign troops from Egypt. Establishment of UNEF. On November 7, 1956, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 112, authorizing the establishment of the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF. Mandate of UNEF. UNEF was tasked with supervising the withdrawal of invading forces, Israeli, British, and French, from Egyptian territory and establishing a buffer zone to prevent renewed hostilities. International contributions. Troops from various contributing countries were part of UNEF. The force included contingents from non-aligned nations, such as Canada, Colombia, Denmark, India, Norway, Sweden, and Yugoslavia. Duration of deployment. UNEF was deployed from November 1956 to March 1967. Its initial mandate was extended several times to maintain peace in the region. The deployment of UNEF in 1956 marked a significant development in the concept of UN peacekeeping. It demonstrated the international community's commitment to resolving conflicts and maintaining peace through the deployment of multinational forces under the UN flag. The success of UNEF in facilitating the withdrawal of foreign troops and preventing further hostilities contributed to the evolution and expansion of UN peacekeeping efforts in subsequent years. 3. World Food Program established, 1961. In 1960, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower proposed to the UN General Assembly that a workable scheme should be devised for providing food aid through the UN system. The following year, the Assembly approved the establishment of the World Food Program, WFP, on a 3-year experimental basis. The WFP got off the ground immediately, however, providing urgently needed food supplies to the victims of a 1962 earthquake, Iran, and hurricane, Thailand, as well as to some 5 million refugees resettling in Algeria. Today, though there are still some 820 million people affected by hunger worldwide, the efforts of the WFP have helped that number fall by more than 100 million in the past decade. 4. UNICEF wins Nobel Peace Prize, 1965. The creation of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, dates back to 1946 when it grew out of the pressing need to provide food, clothing and health care to the children of war-ravaged Europe. The program became a permanent part of the United Nations in 1953. In 1959, the General Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which represented the first major international consensus on the fundamental principles of children's rights, including shelter, education, healthcare, and good nutrition. In awarding UNICEF its Peace Prize in 1965, the Nobel Committee lauded the organization for promoting brotherhood among the nations, and for realizing that children provide the key to the future. Now in more than 190 countries, UNICEF remains the world's leading organization for children. 5. Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, 1968. The UN's first resolution, adopted way back in January 1946, focused on peaceful uses of atomic energy and the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. Although this landmark treaty, approved in June 1968, ultimately did not stop nuclear proliferation, it represented a major success for advocates of arms control, especially coming in the middle of the Cold War, and set a precedent for international cooperation on the issue. Since then, nuclear-armed nations such as South Africa and Kazakhstan have voluntarily agreed to give up their atomic weapons, while other countries have vowed to end nuclear research programs and submit to inspections by the UN International Atomic Energy Agency. 6. International Women's Year, 1975. Support for women's rights was actually built into the United Nations Charter. Article 1 reads, "To achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion." The General Assembly designated 1975 as International Women's Year, and organized the first World Conference on Women in Mexico City. Since 2010, the UN entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women, known as UN Women, continues its efforts to support women's rights, particularly the need to end violence against women. In 2014, UN Women Goodwill Ambassador Emma Watson launched the He for She campaign, which calls on men to fight for gender equality and combat violence and discrimination against women. 7. UNESCO names 12 initial sites for protection, 1978. In 1978, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, published its first list of 12 World Heritage Sites, those man-made monuments or natural areas deserving of special protection due to their outstanding value. Aside from the original list, which included the Galapagos Islands and Yellowstone National Park, UNESCO now protects nearly 1,000 sites worldwide, helping set the standard for the preservation of some of our most important historic monuments and natural treasures. 8. Kyoto Protocol, 1997. This international treaty, named for the Japanese city where it was adopted, committed 41 countries plus the European Union to reduce the emission of dangerous greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. Called by many the most significant environmental treaty in history, its success would be hampered by the fact that three major carbon-emitting nations, China, India, and the United States, do not abide by the protocol. In 2012, participants voted to extend the Kyoto Protocol until 2020 and pledged to create a new climate change treaty requiring all greenhouse gas-producing countries, including those not bound by the Kyoto Protocol, to limit and reduce their emissions. This became the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015. 9. Declaration of Commitment on HIV/AIDS, 2001. Since 1996, UN efforts to combat acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, and its cause, the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, have been coordinated by the joint United Nations Programme on HIV/AIDS, representing some 10 other UN system agencies. In June 2001, a special session of the UN General Assembly adopted this Declaration of Commitment, which laid out specific national targets and global actions aimed at reversing an epidemic that had caused boundless suffering and death worldwide. Today, UNAIDS remains the leading advocate for global action against HIV/AIDS. In 2022, the program's report showed a 58% reduction in new HIV infections among children from 2010 to 2022. 10. First ever UN Emergency Health Mission, 2014. To combat an unprecedented Ebola epidemic in West Africa, including nearly 30,000 people infected and 11,000 killed, the United Nations established its first ever emergency health mission, the UN Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, UNMEER, in September 2014. The temporary mission provided financial, logistical and human resources to the hardest-hit countries of Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone, in an effort to bring the number of Ebola cases to zero. UNMEER closed in July 2015, turning oversight of the UN emergency Ebola response over to the World Health Organization, WHO. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.